Hello everybody, welcome back. Now I will explain about the first Hibernate example and what are the different files required to work with Hibernate. Different files required to work with Hibernate are Pojo class, that is plain old Java object, mapping file, configuration file, and the client application. What is a Pojo class? If a Java class is not extending any predefined base class or not implementing any predefined interface driven by the API, then we call such type of file as an ordinary Java class of Pojo. A Java bean and Pojo are not the same. In order to say Java class a Java bean, then it has to follow the below rules. Class must be stored in a package. Class must be public. Class implements serializable interface. And properties of the class, that is variables, should be private. And the class must contain public default constructor. And for each variable or property, a public setter and a getter are required. And in the if the above rules, even though a Java class is not following some rules, still we are calling that class as a Java bean. In Hibernate, we need Pojo classes but not Java beans. In a Pojo class also, we use setter and getters and default constructors. Now, second one is the mapping file. It is an XML file which contains associations between Pojo class name to table name and Pojo class variables name to the table column names. A mapping file is identified with a file name dot a file name dot sorry a mapping file is identified with mapping file name dot hbm dot xml. A mapping file is an XML file, so its extension is .xml, and Hibernate has added a standard to identify the mapping file easily by providing the extension of .hbm.xml. And extension .hbm is optional, but it is recommended for a mapping file named by Hibernate. For example, student.hbm.xml can also be named as student.xml, but Hibernate recommended to use .hbm for easy identification of the mapping file. In the following mapping files, while constructing the Hibernate mapping XML file, ID represents the primary key mapping and property element represents the non-primary key mapping. In Hibernate mapping file, ID element is mandatory and it must be written before the property elements. And even though a table does not contain a primary key, but in the mapping file, we must map any one column of the table as ID. And in Hibernate mapping file, ID element is allowed for once, but property element can be repeated any number of times. If a table has more than one primary key, then we call it as a composite key. In this case, we should add composite ID in the place of ID element in the mapping file. And while writing the mapping file, if Pojo class variable name and table column name both are matching, then column attribute is optional in the ID or property element. In the mapping file, variable name, okay, this is about the mapping file. Next is the configuration file. In Hibernate needs some additional properties along with the mapping in order to transfer the objects between Java application and database. The external properties required to the Hibernate will be given to the Hibernate by constructing a configuration file. In a configuration file, we need to add the following three types of properties or information: connection properties, Hibernate properties, and mapping resources. By using connection properties, Hibernate will establish a connection with the database internally. Hibernate properties are used to add some additional information to the Hibernate. Mapping resources is to configure the name and location of mapping files. In Hibernate, mapping files and configuration files are not supported or loaded. When configuration file is loaded, the mapping files are also loaded automatically. In order to load the mapping files also along with the configuration file, we need to configure the name, location of the mapping file into the configuration file. A configuration file is identified with configuration file name .cfg.xml. The extension .cfg is a Hibernate standard and it is optional, but it is recommended to use the extensions as .cfg.xml in order to identify a configuration file easily. Up to Hibernate 2.x version, the configuration is provided in Hibernate in the form of properties file or resource bundle. From Hibernate 3.x, we are using XML file rather than properties file to provide Hibernate configuration. So this is about the configuration file. And while constructing Hibernate applications, we create one configuration file for each database. It means if we want to communicate with three databases simultaneously or concurrently, then we need to construct three Hibernate configuration files. Hibernate configuration files is said to be the heart of the Hibernate application. And while constructing Hibernate mapping files, we can create number of mapping files in a Hibernate application. It means either we can create an individual mapping file for each Pojo class or we can create a common mapping file for all Pojo classes. Hibernate configuration file and mapping files. If any changes are done in the XML or XML files, that is Hibernate configuration and mapping files are the XML files, and if any changes are done in these XML files, then we no need to recompile the Java code. We can execute the Java code without making any changes. And while working with the framework software, all the framework software follow some common principles. One of the common principles is framework contains a central configuration file, and when framework application starts in a high level object of the framework, and that high level object is responsive to produce the low level object required in order to work with the framework application. Now we'll see what are the steps required for the client application. Step 1 is to import the Hibernate API into the Java client application. And we have multiple packages which contains a set of classes and interfaces to develop a client application using Hibernate. The following two packages are called base packages of Hibernate API, and we need to import these two packages in each client application of Hibernate. Import org.hibernate.star and import org.hibernate.cfg.star. Then step 2 is to create an object of configuration class. Configuration is a class given in org.hibernate.cfg package. By creating configuration class object, we have bootstrapping the Hibernate environment into a Java application. That is configuration conf object configuration object conf equal to new configuration. And step 3, call configure method of configuration class for loading Hibernate configuration file. While calling configure method, we need to pass the configuration XML file name as parameter. And if the configuration XML file name is hibernate.cfg.xml, then the file name is optional to pass as a parameter. If we use Hibernate configuration file name as other than hibernate.cfg.xml, then it is mandatory to pass XML file name as a parameter in configuration. The syntax is conf.configure of hibernate.cfg.xml. Then configure method is called Hibernate internally uses DOM and SACS. DOM stands for Document Object Model and SACS stands for Simple API for XML parsers, and reads both the configuration and mapping data for XML files and stores the data into the instance variables of the class. Whenever Hibernate configuration file loaded, then automatically the mapping files are loaded and we do not require to load the mapping files separately. And step 4 is to create a high-level object of Hibernate called Session Factory. Session Factory is an interface given in org.hibernate package, and its implementation class is Session Factory. Implementation class is given by Hibernate Framework, and it is available in org.hibernate.impl package. So to get session factory, we need to call build session factory method of configuration class. That is, syntax is session factory equal to conf.build session factory. The next step is the step 5 is to create or get a session object. Session Factory produces sessions, and session is runtime interface between Java application and Hibernate framework. All methods perform operations on database to perform operations on the database are provided by the session object. Session is an interface, and session implementation is uh, implement session implementation is implemented class. Session interface is given in org.hibernate package, and session impl is an implemented class given in org.hibernate.impl package. And the syntax is session object, session equal to factory.open session. And one session factory can produce any number of sessions. Then step 6 is begin or open a logical transaction while performing save, update, delete operations from a Java application to database. In Hibernate, we need a logical transaction. If we are reading or loading objects from the database, we do not require any logical transaction in Hibernate because select operation does not belong to transaction operation. In order to get a transaction of Hibernate, we need to call begin transaction given by session interface. So the syntax is transaction tx equal to session.begin transaction. Then step 7 is to perform the operations on the database by using the methods and objects produced by session interface. That is syntax is session.save of object or session.update of object or session.delete of object. Then step 8 is commit the logical transaction after the compilation of operations. While executing the operations again, the database, if any exception is caused, occurred or error is occurred, then Hibernate automatically roll back the transaction and Hibernate execution will be thrown back to the Java application. The syntax is tx.commit method. And step 9 is after compilation of a transaction, we need to, after completion of the transaction, we need to close the session produced by a session factory. After closing all the sessions produced by session factory, we need to close the session factory of Hibernate. And syntax is session.close and factory.close method. And here all the frameworks belongs to Java EE Enterprise module. All Java EE softwares are non-installable softwares and we will get the software in the form of set of jar files. And working with the framework software is nothing but adding the set of jar files into the class part before executing the framework applications. In all the frameworks, we have the main jar file and dependent jar files. The main jar file contains the API used in the Java application, and dependent jar file contains the API used in the classes and interfaces. While compiling the Java application, the main jar file is required to set in the class path, and while executing, we need both main and dependent jar files into the class path. When we download Hibernate software, then we will get a zip file, and after that we need to unzip the zip file. The main jar file Hibernate is hibernate3.jar and it exists in the root folder of the software, and the dependent jar file exists in the lib folder. So this is about the first example of the Hibernate. And so I will show you how to run a first Hibernate application. How to run a first Hibernate application. First create a Java application. Go to file, new, and then create a Java project first. For first Hibernate application, go to file, new, and create a Java project. Then give the name for the Java project as first Hibernate. Then inside the source, create one package com.hibernate. And inside the package, create two classes. One is employee.java, which is a Pojo class. It contains the properties, integer ID, string first name and last name, and the setters and the getter methods. This is the Pojo class employee.java. And the next one is store data.java. And these two files, employee.java and store data, and this is the client application file. Store data.java is the client application. It should be created in this package. These two files should be created in this package, whereas the configuration files, these XML files, should be created in the source. That is, right click on the source. That is, you need to right click on the source, new, and go to other, and create an XML file which is located in the XML folder. Then say next and give the file name and say finish. That's how you create these employee.hbm.xml and hibernate.cfg.xml. Both are XML files. So now what this contains, employee.hbm.xml is a mapping file, and it contains the class name as com.hibernate.employee. It is the package name followed by class name, and the table is emp1000. First, what you need to do, go to the MySQL database and create one table emp1000 with ID integer 11 primary key auto increment, first name varchar of 25, last name varchar of 25. You need to create the table for this emp1000. Then come back to Eclipse, and inside the class you have an ID attribute, ID name equal ID attribute, ID name equal to ID, and generator class equal to assign. Next, property name equal to first name, and another property is last name. This is the mapping file. And next one is the, excuse me, here I am getting an error, so I need to comment this detail. And next one is the Hibernate configuration file. The next one is the Hibernate configuration file. So the next one is the Hibernate configuration file. Inside this Hibernate configuration file, I'm having session factory, and property name is hbm2ddl.auto, which value of this is update, and the property name, next property name is dialect, and the dialect for MySQL is org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect, and the next property name is connection.url, where you need to give the URL of MySQL, that is jdbc colon mysql colon / localhost colon 3306 / hibernate is the database name. And next property is the connection.username. Username is the loop code here. And property name, next property name is connection.password, where password is loop code. Next property name is connection.driver underscore class, where this is the driver of the MySQL, com.mysql.cj.jdbc.driver. And the mapping resource, we need to provide the mapping file name here, employee.hbm.xml, and end the session factory. Then go to the client application, store data.java, starts with public static void main string args, and configuration conf equal to new configuration, conf.configure. You need to provide the configuration file in this method, hibernate.cfg.xml. Then produce an object for session factory interface, session factory equal to conf.build session factory. Then produce an object for session equal to factory.open session. Then transaction T equal to session.begin transaction. Then create an object for employee E1 equal to new employee. Then set the values for ID, set the value for ID and first name and last name, and store into the employee object. Then session.save E1. Then store this object, employee object, in the session. Then t.commit. You commit the transaction. Then system.out.println successfully saved. Then close the factory and the session. Now when you run on this client application, click on the client application and say run as, and run this Java application. You don't require any server for this. You don't require any server for this Hibernate. Just you need to run on the. Just you need to run as a Java application only. I'll do one thing. I'll stop here. I'll set the ID as 2. I'll give another set of values. I will give here. Set the ID as 2 and name as James. Now run this application again. It's Java application. Okay, then it is output is printed successfully saved. Now you go to the database and check whether the values or records are stored or not. Whether the records are inserted into this table EMP1000. Then you can see here. Second ID is James and Johnny. First name is James and last name is Johnny, which we have given. So this is how you will run the first Hibernate application. Hope you understood, and I'll stop here. Continue in the next video. Thank you.